It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. This may not be what you were thinking about over Mother's Day weekend, but as we sit here on May 11th, there is no New York State budget for the fiscal year that began when? All the way back on April 1st. So let's take stock of what's in, because some things are in that are very consequential, what's out, and what's still being debated as of this morning. Some big things appear to be in, including a pied-à-terre tax of a certain kind as the version of taxing the rich that Governor Hochul and Mayor Mamdani could agree on. There's an interesting point of uncertainty about how that would be evaluated and applied. We'll talk about that. Also, a provision to cooperate less with ICE. This hasn't gotten so much notice, but it was certainly noticed by border czar Tom Homan, who basically told New York, you do that, it's going to backfire. Listen.
What's going to happen in places like New York, and you let people that want to pass this ridiculous legislation not to work with us, we're going to flood the zone. You're going to see more ICE agents you've ever seen before. So congratulations. Because when we send these teams out there, we'll find a bad guy. Most times we do. And when we find a bad guy, he's with others. Others who may not be a priority target, but they're in the country illegally. There weren't people we were looking for, but we found them during these operations. Well, guess what? They're coming too.
They're coming. And I know the sound on there was a little off mic. He was speaking at an event, but I think it was audible. More ICE, not less, in New York if this bill goes through, Tom Homan says. And if you're confused about the state of the whole thing, why shouldn't you be? After all, Governor Hochul said this last Thursday.
Today's the day. I want to thank you all for joining us, and I'm very proud to announce that we've reached a general agreement for the fiscal year 2027 state budget.
You did? Wait. A few hours later, Assembly Speaker Carl Heastie told the press,
there's no budget deal. There's no deal.
And Heastie got specific.
I said to her last night, I was comfortable with her saying to y'all, we were close. It is close. But this is what's wrong with this process. It's like, I'm going to only talk about policy, and then when I think the legislature is giving me what I want on policy, then we'll talk about money. There's so many open issues on money where, in all parts of the budget, the governor's team, the Senate team, the Assembly's team sign off. We've signed off on nothing major. And this is what I'm telling y'all is wrong with this process. And I'm saying this to y'all very clearly. I'm never doing this again. Budgets are supposed to be about money, not policy.
Budgets are supposed to be about money, not policy. But if you've been listening to the show, you know there have been so many policy items that are not specifically, explicitly about spending that have gone into the negotiations this year. And Heastie said there, Speaker of the Assembly, right? Assembly member from the Bronx, who's the Speaker of the New York State Assembly. There are so many open issues on money. So we're going to get to some of those too. But if you're confused, you're in good company. By the way, credit to Newsmax for that Tom Homan clip, which came from a border security expo. They called it in Arizona last Tuesday. But if you're confused in New York, you're in good company. We're going to try to sort through it, more details of what's actually in the framework that might affect your life, what isn't, and what any of it means for New Yorkers, because this is a budget year with some particularly consequential tax and spend and policy decisions that will eventually come down, presumably any day. One major piece we're saving for tomorrow, just want to tell you, is climate. You probably know Hochul is pulling back or trying to on the state's 2030 emissions mandate because she says it's got too many affordability implications for regular New Yorkers. Some of the legislature environmentalists also disagree. That one we will give its own segment tomorrow. But for everything else, joining me now is Jimmy Vielkind, New York State Issues reporter for WNYC and Gothamist. Hey, Jimmy, happy Monday.
Good morning, Brian. Happy Mud Day. We still don't have a budget.
Yeah, I kept looking for you or other Albany reporter John Campbell to drop a story over the weekend. I was periodically, whatever else I was doing, was checking in on Gothamist to see, okay, this is going to happen any minute. Did it come yet? Because I know we're going to talk about this on Monday. But no. So what on earth is going on in Albany?
This is sort of the typical dance. And as I think we've talked about before, the biggest dynamic here is that Governor Hochul bit off a lot in this budget process, perhaps more than people are able to quickly chew and swallow. And it's just taking a considerable amount of time. Any of her legislative pieces or the policy pieces that have become attached to this budget would in and of themselves occupy weeks as standalone legislation. The governor has clearly, now that she's completing her first full term in office, concluded that her best bet to get a legislative agenda through is to just cram it all into the budget. It sort of sucks up all the oxygen at the Capitol, and lawmakers who are sort of used to a regular order where the budget is dealt with in the first half of the lawmaking season, usually by April 1st-ish. And then they have sort of a second half of the game between the middle or the end of June to do other policy matters. They've just sort of been caught off guard. So you played that clip from Speaker Hastie. He's clearly very frustrated about this. He has complained about the lack of power and the governor just sort of setting the agenda. So what we saw was things boil over and a lack of progress over Mother's Day weekend, where my mother got a card, not a Gothamist story about the state budget. So.
Yeah, and I guess probably a lot of the legislators' mothers got cards and visits, and so they weren't working yesterday, or is that wrong?
From what I can discern, there has not been a meeting of Governor Hochul and the legislative leaders since last week. So the governor is in New York City today. She's not at the Capitol. Members of the State Assembly and Senate are expected today to pass yet another temporary extender to keep the government paying some of its bills. And we're slowly working through a number of these issues that, as best I can understand, were discussed and fleshed out in a little bit more detail by lawyers and other aides over the weekend.
And let me ask you to key on one particular line from that Hastie clip where he said there are so many open issues on money. And that's the budget piece, obviously. But the things that we've been talking about mostly on this show over time, the things that have been getting the most press in general, are the policy pieces, right? The climate piece, which I said we'll do a separate on tomorrow, the pied-à-terre tax, maybe that straddles between money and policy, the ICE cooperation with ICE piece, the car insurance thing, how many speeding tickets it should take before the state requires you to get a speed limiter in your car. We did a segment partly on that last week. So those are all the policy things that I think are sucking a lot of the air out of the media coverage from the actual, what he called open issues on money in the budget. So can you cite one or two of those that are significant?
Well, sure. Let's start with the pied-à-terre tax. There was general agreement. That's Hochul's favorite military figure, general agreement, about the pied-à-terre tax, and with the goal of raising $500 million. But it's still unclear how many properties within the 5 boroughs of New York City such a tax would apply to and what the tax rates would be. And part of that stems from how do you value a property? Right? Trump Tower, the gold-plated triplex that we've all seen on TV and in magazines for years, it was actually only valued at around $7 million, according to city tax documents, and therefore assessed at below the $5 million that Governor Hochul has said was the $5 million threshold that Governor Hochul initially set for this. So she said that she and city officials are trying to figure out some kind of new way between recent sales data or sales prices and the current system by which New York City values properties for taxations and assesses them. So that's a very complicated thing, and it has implications for Mayor Mamdani's budget. Would you like me to go through a few others, Brian?
Just let's stay on pied-à-terre for a minute, because I think that's really interesting, and a lot of people find it really interesting, even though it's going to affect very few people. As you say, on second homes, not people's primary residences, only on second homes that are in the city of New York and that are valued at $5 million or more. That's a $5 million second home. So we're talking about an extremely financially elite, small group of people who that would affect, but I guess they hope it generates a fair amount of income. How will they settle how to value? I mean, if you see what things look like on StreetEasy or Zillow or something, what any kind of property is selling for, and, or the assessed property tax rate based on a certain kind of valuation of a property, and what things actually go for when they are on the market, they can be really, really different. So how are they going to settle that?
I don't have much insight. I think that maybe it'll be an accepted thing like Zillow.com or Realtor.com or whatever, and they use the Z estimate and tax that. The thing here that could happen, Brian, and this is actually maybe something that I would put somewhere on my bingo card with decent odds, is the state could just say, New York City shall figure this out. New York City shall pass a pied-à-terre tax, and they figure out all the nitty-gritty here, and sort of kind of punt that down to the city's tax department and financial folks, and just authorize broadly that it shall apply to second homes worth $5 million or more, and that it should have target revenue of $500 million. If you remember, that's basically what the state did when it authorized congestion pricing. It gave broad power to a subset of the MTA to figure out what the actual tolls were going to be. It just set the broad parameters. Right. And therefore, any lawmaker didn't have to devote the brain power to it, and also could say, oh, well, I don't know about that exact tax rate. Sorry.
Well, that on the one hand kicks the can down the road and puts what might have been a state decision that would be in the budget that establishes the tax into the hands of City Hall, which on the one hand you could say they're dumping it on on the city. Maybe Mayor Mamdani would be perfectly happy to have the power to set that valuation himself.
I think so. I spoke recently with James Parrott, who's an economist at the New School, a left-leaning economist, and he said that the city's tax department is fantastic. They do complex work on valuations all the time. Parrott sat on a property tax reform commission that was convened by former New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio. And he said that throughout the process, he learned that every request for information was quickly dispatched. So he said that the city would absolutely have the capacity to figure this out in its own way.
Interesting. Listeners, anything on any of the outstanding issues or the things that appear to be settled, even if not officially announced, in the New York State budget, questions, comments, stories about how these things might affect you, for Albany Issues reporter Jimmy Vielkind, 212-433. WNYC, jump on in if you would like, 212-433-9692. Call or text 212-433-9692. Just one more thing on pied-à-terre tax. Mamdani made this one particular finance industry mogul's penthouse the centerpiece of his public push for this tax, a $238 million penthouse, apparently, and then he threatened to move a lot of jobs out of New York, and then Governor Hochul had a meeting with him, just the two of them, no Mamdani in the room. Tell us a little bit of that story. First, who are we talking about?
We're talking about Ken Griffin, whose, I believe his firm is Citadel, was founded in Chicago, but because New York City is the financial capital of the world, he recognizes that top financial employees are located in and around Manhattan. And so Citadel is, I believe, planning a $6 billion headquarters up on Park Avenue. And Governor Hochul said she had long-standing meeting on the books with Griffin just to talk about his investment, to talk about his sensibilities. But, paying so much for an apartment made him kind of a perfect boogeyman. And he is, of course, someone who has sort of leaned in publicly to a public defense of wealth acquisition, and capitalism. And so, it remains to be seen whether or not he will pull back on some of that investment, whether more jobs will be shifted from New York City to other locations in the country as a result of this. That is certainly always the claim and counter argument to raising taxes on the wealthy. This is an argument made by the wealthy that they'll just put their assets and their wealth and their business and activity in other jurisdictions to avoid that taxation. So here, Griffin seemed to be relishing leaning in for the fight. And I think Hochul certainly has treated that seriously. And even Mamdani, I think, has backed off a little bit in the heat of his rhetoric toward Griffin.
Is there a way to get that same level of taxation on the second home? And again, oh my God, I'll make people's heads explode with even imagining what that lifestyle might be like, where you can afford a $238 million second home, that penthouse. But is there a version of politics or smoothing out ruffled feathers where this tax can go through, but Griffin doesn't feel personally attacked and doesn't move all those jobs?
We saw in 2019 the stars seemingly align for a pied-à-terre tax, where Governor Cuomo, who was always pretty sympathetic to real estate interests and real estate developers in the city, said that he would support it. Legislators long proposing and supporting this tax said they were on board, and it essentially got pared back into an addition to the real estate transfer tax, which is whenever you sell a piece of property above a certain dollar threshold, the government takes a cut. So most people who buy or sell residential properties or any kind of property pay this tax upon sale. But because the annual bill and the annual valuation, all these things that we have been talking about as complicated to figure out were complicated, lawmakers essentially went in another direction. I don't know if they're going to back off. This is an election year for Governor Hochul, and frankly, there is one Ken Griffin, and there are potentially millions of New Yorkers who would be happy to see him taxed. I also don't believe that he's even a voter in New York. So from a political standpoint, I don't know that his rhetoric is necessarily going to be enough to really move the needle. Think back, Brian, we had politicians proudly stand up to stop Amazon from building second headquarters in Queens, and we have not seen any negative political consequences for any of them.
Yeah, but if the pied-à-terre tax does fail like it did in 2019, as you just described, is there any other model on the table for, quote, taxing the rich to close the budget deficit that the city is facing? And we'll get to a little more on that. Or to, start going further and really funding universal child care or any of the mayor's other priorities?
This seems to be where Governor Hochul has relented. She has stood against Mayor Mamdani's push to raise the city income tax, against his push to raise corporate taxes within New York City as ways that he and the Democratic Socialists who supported his campaign and other people who supported his campaign wanted to tax the rich. Governor Hochul has stood against that. She says that those measures speak to the overall tax climate of New York, which she is concerned makes it difficult to recruit some businesses into the state and into New York City. But the pied-à-terre tax, in her telling, was something that was for people who already do not live in New York, who have already moved and shielded their income tax and their investment income from New York State and New York City. So she seems keen to allow this. And from everything I gather, including up to the latest in budget talks, she is not willing to entertain some of these alternative proposals, like raising the income tax, like raising the corporate tax, that someone like Mayor Mamdani would be happy to pursue.
Some interesting questions coming in on this via text. Listener writes, with this $5 million tax, or it's really a tax on second homes worth $5 million, apply to owners of multi-unit buildings, or is it just single-family dwellings? So that's pretty interesting. I think the answer is single-family dwellings, but I see where that curiosity is coming from. Listener wants to know what if you have your primary residence somewhere and you're a landlord of a multi-unit building, would it apply to that?
As described by all the officials, it would look to single residential units that are not owner-occupied. And so it's difficult to answer this with big specificity because no one in the public has seen legislative language and seen what the actual law is going to state on this. But as described by Governor Hochul and other supporters, this would not apply to multifamily buildings or structures that have a value of more than $5 million. It's really individual residential units with a value of $5 million or more. Big asterisks on value because they haven't figured out how they will determine that value.
I'll acknowledge that there are a number of texts coming in with this kind of sentiment. One, now they're coming in too fast. The wealthy are destabilizing our government. Good riddance. Goodbye, Ken Griffin. Yes, leave the city that has given you so much. There's another one. The Ken Griffin is a whiny billionaire, so you get that sentiment. A lot of people are texting versions of that. But here's another one. Let's see. I don't know if you're in the weeds enough to answer this question, but a listener writes, let's see, this is about California. Sorry about this. Now it went away. But there's the question, which I'll do as best as I can from memory, is there any conversation about what they're doing in California, which the listener describes, I'm still trying to find it, as taxing.
I believe that's a wealth tax, Brian, where not a tax on income, but a tax on accumulated assets and wealth. And to answer that, there has been some conversation about that, but many officials say that it would be very, very, very difficult to implement that on a state level, even in a state as big and robust as New York, for a couple of reasons. First, there isn't a tradition in the United States of wealth taxation, of taxing those accumulated assets. So anything is sort of subject to a lot of legal challenge. People might remember that it was not until the early 20th century that voters in the United States amended the U.S. Constitution to explicitly allow for an income tax. So I expect there would be some big legal back and forth over the question of a wealth tax. And then the second argument of that is, again, this argument of if one state imposes such a tax, what will its residents do? And will a state have the authority to tax wealth that is outside of its borders and outside of its jurisdictions? So as I understand the situation in California, it is the result not of legislation, but of a ballot initiative. And here in one of the things that makes New York the Empire State is that it's essentially impossible to get something on the ballot. We don't believe in empowering our citizens to do referenda like some other states do in New York. So there isn't really a chance for a wealth tax to be put forward from a citizen initiative. And there hasn't been much serious talk about it among state lawmakers, or certainly Governor Hochul, for the reasons that I just went through.
Right. And here's that California text. I'll read now exactly what the listener wrote. Has there been any discussion within the legislature and conversations with the governor about what's happening in the state of California with their billionaire's tax, where they want to tax property, not real estate? And by property, this person means a one-time 5% on things you own other than your home. It's causing a lot of the top California billionaires to buy homes in Florida, says this texter, and elsewhere where they won't have this tax problem. So that's that wealth tax that you were just describing. I'm going to take one more on pied-à-terre tax. People have a lot to say about this, and then we'll move on to some of the other issues that are either resolved or outstanding in the New York State budget. Here is Reverend Peter Cook calling from Albany, the belly of the beast. Hi, Reverend Cook. You're on WNYC.
Hi, Reverend Peter Cook. I'm principal of Faith in the Public Square, calling from Albany, New York. My state senator, Pat Fahey, has introduced a proposal to do a pied-à-terre tax outside of New York City with a lower valuation of, I think, like $2.5 million. I was curious, Jimmy, if you might comment on that proposal. Is it included in the governor's proposed revenue? And also, what other revenue proposals is she making to help deal with the struggle of cities across the state and not just in New York City?
I take it from your question, Reverend, that you would like to see a second home tax more broadly applied. Again, that $5 million or more valuation is just on second homes in New York City. And I know there is this other idea to expand it to the rest of the state. So I guess that would be second homes of people who primarily live in New York City, who may have second homes in the Hudson Valley, something like that. I take it you would like to see that? Is that why you're raising it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just think that the governor's proposals for added revenue are pretty thin. I love the pied-à-terre tax idea in New York City, but I'd like to see that applied to second homes in other parts of the state.
Thank you for your call. Jimmy, is it in? Is it out? Is it under discussion? What can you say about that? And then I'll note that he did also ask about other revenue options, and we'll get to that next.
Sure. So, Reverend Cook, as of now, it does not sound like the option for a pied-à-terre tax in other localities is in the budget talks. Speaker Hastie said last week that it was something that emanated from Senator Fahey and some other rank-and-file legislators who live in upstate New York, but that it didn't pierce through and it's not really on the table in this budget. As for other revenue, the quick answer is the big tax and the big new tax item has to do with Zyn, or more broadly, non-smokable nicotine that people put in their mouths. Governor Hochul proposed changing the way that's classified to increase the tax on it. And from what I understand from top leaders, that is in the budget and is expected to go through.
And a while ago, like 10 minutes ago, you were going to answer my question based on the Carl Hastie clip of so many open issues on money still in these budget negotiations. So this pied-à-terre tax is one, and we lingered on that because a lot of people were interested in it. What's another?
Well, one big question is that has to do with that has big fiscal implications. It has to do with about almost 500,000 New Yorkers who are set to have their state-backed health insurance disrupted because of H.R. 1, or the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill Act that was passed by Republicans and signed by President Trump last summer. So this changed the eligibility for non-citizens to have government-backed health insurance. And in New York, the essential plan has been open to this population of people. But as a result of these federal changes, nearly 500,000 people are going to lose insurance. And it's been a lingering question.
Can we just say that again? Because I don't think, I saw that number, but I don't think it's gotten enough press. So I just want you to say that again. Yeah. 500,000 people just in New York State are going to lose their health insurance?
It's planned for disruptions. And Brian, that number is a little squishy. It's a little bit less than 500,000. And there is talk among some people, I don't know how optimistic this is, that some of those people in that group would be able to obtain health insurance through employers or some other means. But no matter which way you slice it, hundreds of thousands of people in the state of New York expected to lose health insurance coverage and have already received letters notifying them that their health insurance coverage will be dropped this summer. And so the question is, should New York State step in and shoulder the cost that had mostly been borne by the federal government to continue to grant this government and state-backed health insurance? And as of right now, that's not something in Governor Hochul's plan, and it's not something that legislative leaders have put forward, citing what would be a pretty big fiscal cost but it seems to still be up in the air.
So they take this structural change and put it all on the backs of these hundreds of thousands of individuals as individuals?
Our colleague, Caroline Lewis, has done some great reporting on this at Gothamist. My understanding is that individuals would have to purchase health insurance on the market. I don't believe they would be eligible for some of the subsidies that have previously made individuals who buy health insurance on the health insurance exchanges a little bit more affordable. But I don't want to say anything definitive because it's not an area that I've done super deep reporting.
Even more of these consequential things that are in the New York State budget negotiations with Jimmy right after this. Brian Lehrer on WNYC, and to reset, here we are on May 11th after the New York State budget for the fiscal year that is already in progress was supposed to be in by the first day of that fiscal year, which was April 1st. But there are so many budget issues and non-budget issues, policy issues that aren't actually strictly budget issues, which is really frustrating. Assembly Speaker Carl Hastie says, just take all this policy out of the budget. Let's just do a budget. Then we'll get to the policy issues as policy issues. But they're negotiating and negotiating and negotiating. Switching gears to another of those policy issues, immigration. The framework includes a package of new restrictions on how state and local police can cooperate with ICE. I'm going to replay something that we aired a half hour ago now to introduce the segment. It's border czar Tom Homan, as recorded by Newsmax at an event last Tuesday, basically threatening New York with an infusion of ICE agents if this bill goes through that would have local police cooperate less. Listen.
What's going to happen in places like New York and these other people that want to pass this ridiculous legislation not to work with us? We're going to flood the zone. You're going to see more ICE agents you've ever seen before. So congratulations. Because when we send these teams out there, we'll find a bad guy. Most times we do. And when we find a bad guy, he's with others. Others who may not be a priority target, but they're in the country illegally. There weren't people we were looking for, but we found them during these operations. Well, guess what? They're coming too.
So that's a threat we've heard from Tom Homan so many times. It's not just a threat, it's reality, obviously, since President Trump took office for his second term, saying, yeah, we say we're looking for the bad guys, the violent criminals who are here illegally, but if we find any other undocumented people in the course of our investigations, or if they're hanging around, or if they're in the same household, they may be picked up too, even if they are otherwise productive residents of the United States. So, Jimmy, and our guest is Jimmy Vielkind, our New York State Issues reporter at WNYC and Gothamist. What's actually new here? New York is already a sanctuary city, a sanctuary state. So what is Governor Hochul proposing to add here? And is that threat from Tom Homan having any repercussions?
Well, so New York is not a sanctuary state. There are policies in place that restrict how New York state agencies, including the state police, gather citizenship data from people, but there is no blanket policy on local police departments about what they can and cannot do vis-a-vis sharing information and cooperating with the federal government. And there is really no state law about what the New York State Police or state agencies can do. This is an executive order that was signed by the last guy who was governor some years ago. So this proposal, and I have to add the proviso that I and the public have not seen the actual legislative language here, so I can't be too specific at times. It would do a number of things that would be positive steps forward, according to advocates, but still falls short of the real blanket sanctuary policies that exist in some other states and that they would have liked to see in a measure called New York for All. So here's what it would do, as best we understand. First, New York is proposing to ban formal 287G cooperation agreements with the federal government. Now, under this program, which has become more popular, deputies of local police departments are essentially cross-deputized to become ICE agents and act doing immigration enforcement. Now, these agreements can have multiple forms. One of the most aggressive counties using them is Nassau County, right east of Queens, and led by Bruce Blakeman, who is the Republican candidate for governor. I don't think that's a coincidence, and I think it's an important piece of context here, in which there are police officers in Nassau County on detail working with ICE to find criminals and apprehend them and use county resources. Other counties throughout the state, and there are about a half dozen, I think a little more, but the number is somewhat fluid, they have more limited agreements where they work with ICE dealing with people incarcerated at their jails and doing warrant checks on them. I had one sheriff from upstate Rensselaer County to say that was what his 287G agreement means with the federal government. Those agreements, if Governor Hochul gets what she wants and if this law is passed as expected, would be banned going forward. A second major piece here has to do with a prohibition on local jails from housing people who are detained for immigration enforcement purposes. There were about 8 counties in the state that were doing this. Again, the biggest one is Nassau County on Long Island. Currently, local jails provide space for detainees for a number of reasons. If the U.S. Marshals are looking for someone wanted for a federal crime, there aren't many federal prisons in New York that would take someone short term. So local jails often take that person into custody and hold them while they're awaiting trial. So this legislation would ban people detained for immigration offenses from being held in local jails.
Can I jump in on that one?
Of
because
course.
Are the immigrant advocates, entirely down with that? I could imagine a world, this is the first I'm learning of this issue, so I'm just thinking, wait, would they rather have them held at Alcatraz Alley or somewhere like that? Alligator Alcatraz, I mean, as opposed to a local jail in Rensselaer County? You know what I mean?
Yeah, this is something that is desired by advocates. It's actually the rough provisions of a bill called Dignity Not Detention, which has been sponsored for several years by State Senator Julia Salazar, who is a Democratic socialist representing Brooklyn. And her argument is that public resources and state and local taxpayer resources should not be used in furthering what Salazar and others view as a very flawed mass deportation agenda being carried out right now by the federal government. But Brian, your argument is also correct. I spoke to county sheriffs whose jails house some of these individuals, and they say it's a revenue stream. It is a facility that is perhaps close to the point of contact where someone is detained, right? If my loved one were
where
taken,
their families are, right?
Precisely. And so they say, and they have the space so that there is a benefit. But really, it speaks to the desire to be separate from any activity of the federal government. And we know particularly in downstate areas in and around New York City, it's difficult to find lots of space. It's find space for anything, including incarcerating or detaining people. And so we've seen ICE look to convert warehouses. There was, of course, a big controversy in New Jersey about a plan to convert a facility there. So this Dignity Not Detention proposal is expected to be included in this immigration package and be a relatively sound part of it.
Interesting. One more before we run out of time. I see there's a $1 billion utility rebate program first pitched by the Assembly. What is it and who would get checks?
Well, again, we haven't seen the language, so it's not perfectly clear exactly who would benefit. But similar to the way that people got inflation refund checks last year, they would get a utility rebate check this year to pay for the higher rates. Politicians love to give out one-time little checks of money. I'm sure that these will hit mailboxes probably in the first 2 weeks of October or so. It's just magically always the time of year before Election Day when these kind of rebate checks come out. But the exact dollar amounts, I think, remain unsettled. And this was sort of a late add to the budget, as you said, Brian, in response to push from legislators.
All right. So last thing, what's the realistic timeline now? You reported this gets written into 9 bills eventually. that lawmakers vote on over multiple days. From what you've been saying in response to some of my questions, not all these bills are written yet. So when do we actually get a budget? And then I guess the follow-up question, which I'll bake in here, is how does Hochul use it for her reelection? Because that's obviously a big context here. And how does Bruce Blakeman, the presumed Republican nominee, use it against her?
Well, let me start with the last piece first, which is that Governor Hochul is already going around touting what she sees as political wins in this budget. Even though it's not finally agreed to, there are some things that are pretty well baked in. The governor is expected to be in New York City today talking about how this budget is going to increase funding for childcare in two major buckets. It's going to provide additional funding for the CCAP, which is a voucher program for low-income and moderate-income families seeking childcare, as well as, and we talked about this before, Brian, providing the seed money for New York City to start providing free care for some 2-year-olds. Pilot program set a big win, and this is letting Mayor Mamdani say that he is starting to deliver on one of his signature campaign promises. And that money is expected to be in the budget. No one has really raised much of a stink or controversy about it this year, so that's going in. As to the timing of when this spending plan is going to be done, I had thought for a while that we would be wrapping up votes last week. We figured that the governor had her kumbaya moment on Thursday. That's usually a sign to everybody else like, hey, we're pretty much done here. We're settling. We have to write the bills. And then once the bills are written, they have to be reviewed and voted upon. And I figured that process would take place largely over the weekend and the voting would happen in the latter part of this week. But now it seems that things have fallen behind schedule, and because of the speaker's sort of testy rebuttal to what he says was Governor Hochul jumping the gun. I think the optimistic case now and the realistic case, Brian, is that votes would not finish up until next week at the earliest. So you've mentioned that the budget was due April 1st. We are now in the latest state budget since 2010 when David Patterson was governor. And we are in the latest budget of Governor Kathy Hochul's tenure. She, of course, took office in 2021 after the budget season. So she is going later than she's ever gone before.
Big things still hanging in the balance for millions of New Yorkers, certainly those estimated 500,000 who are losing their health insurance because of the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill and all these other things we've talked about today and in previous segments with Jimmy Vielkind and our other colleagues. And obviously we have more to cover yet because this is not yet resolved, even though all of this was supposed to be resolved by April 1st, the beginning of the New York State fiscal year. And here we are on May 11th. Jimmy Vielkind is the New York State issues reporter for WNYC and Gothamist. Jimmy, thanks as always.
Thanks, Brian. Always a pleasure to be with you and your listeners.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.